September 1944. The war thundered on overseas, but in the quiet corners of the United States, life carried a different rhythm. Yet on one late summer morning, the calm pulse of a small southern town faltered, replaced by a rising murmur of disbelief. Buses, painted in faded military green, rumbled down the main street. Their engines coughed as they slowed. Brakes squealing, and through the smudged windows, faces appeared. Faces of men who only months earlier had worn the uniforms of Germany, who had marched under Hitler's banners, and who had fought ferociously against American soldiers on distant battlefields. Now they were prisoners of war, brought across the ocean, arriving in towns where life had once felt untouched by the flames of Europe. The first to notice were the shopkeepers. Mr. Caldwell, who ran the barber shop, froze mid-snip, scissors poised above a customer's ear as he leaned toward the window. Across the street, Mrs. Green, dusting the shelves of her general store, stopped, rag dangling loosely in her hand. Even the children, skipping stones along the edge of the creek, dropped everything and ran toward the road when they heard the engines echoing through the valley. Soon, half the town was gathered, lining the sidewalks, whispering to one another, their eyes fixed on the unlikely convoy. The word spread like wildfire. Germans. Actual Germans. Right here. What people expected was iron chains, cold stares, perhaps even cages, the trappings of an enemy force subdued. Yet as the buses ground to a halt and the doors hissed open, the reality made mouths drop open in shock. The German prisoners stepped down cautiously, one by one, their movements stiff from the long journey, their eyes scanning the unfamiliar streets. They were lean, sunburned and worn, their uniforms stripped of insignia but unmistakably foreign. There was tension in the air, but what made the moment unforgettable was not the sight of the Germans themselves. It was the way they were treated. The guards who flanked them were relaxed, rifles resting easily against their shoulders, not raised, not even gripped tightly. There was no barking of orders, no harsh pulling or shoving. Instead, the guards merely gestured for the prisoners to form up, and the men complied, some even exchanging sheepish glances with the townsfolk watching. They looked more like weary travelers than enemies of the state. Children whispered to their mothers, "Are those Nazis?" One little boy, no more than 8, pointed at a tall blonde prisoner whose blue eyes flicked nervously across the crowd. The mother hushed him quickly, her own gaze darting between the soldiers and the guards, unable to reconcile the scene with the stories pouring in from overseas newspapers. To many Americans, the German soldier was a shadowed figure, ruthless and mechanical, part of a machine that devoured nations. And yet, here they were, dusty, tired, stepping carefully onto American soil under the golden September sun. For the prisoners, the shock cut even deeper. Most of them had spent the voyage across the Atlantic bracing themselves for cruelty. Propaganda back home had painted the Americans as brutal captors, men who would humiliate, starve, or even execute them. They expected cages, concrete cells, and endless suspicion. What they found instead made their hearts pound with confusion. A town that looked almost like a painting, neat houses with porches draped in vines, sidewalks lined with elm trees, and shopfronts with striped awnings fluttering in the breeze. Women in cotton dresses, children clutching books, old men leaning on canes. This was not the America of their nightmares. As they stood in rows, the townspeople noticed small details. The way some prisoners shielded their eyes from the sun, as though they had not seen such brightness in weeks. The way others adjusted their caps nervously, as if waiting for a blow that never came. A few whispered among themselves in German, low and uncertain. And then something almost startling happened. One of the guards, a lanky young man from Alabama, cracked a smile and said something casual to the group. The words meant nothing to the prisoners, but his tone was not hostile. It was ordinary, almost friendly. That small gesture set them further adrift in disbelief. When they were told they would be allowed to walk, supervised but not shackled, a ripple of murmurs ran through the prisoners. Some stiffened, expecting it to be a cruel trick, some test of loyalty that would end in punishment. But as the guards gestured for them to follow, they realized it was genuine. The group began moving, boots tapping against the paved road, and the townsfolk shuffled aside, forming a loose corridor as the men passed. The crowd studied every expression, every step, astonished that the war had come to them not through bombs or gunfire, but through this strange, almost surreal procession. The Germans saw posters in shop windows advertising dances and war bond drives, chalkboards announcing school events, and hand-painted signs offering fresh pies and soda. They passed a cafe where the smell of coffee wafted through the open door, making their stomachs twist with longing. For the first time in months, perhaps years, some of them inhaled the sweet scent of normal life. Their minds reeled. They had been taught that America was decadent, chaotic, immoral. But here it was, ordinary, simple, alive with small-town warmth. The guards watched them carefully, but even that scrutiny was gentle, almost respectful. They did not prod them with bayonets or shout at them in harsh tones. Instead, they walked alongside, keeping pace, as though shepherding a group of tired farmhands rather than enemy soldiers. That difference was not lost on either side. Among the prisoners, there was Karl, a young man barely 20, who had been captured in Normandy after weeks of brutal fighting. His arm still bore scars from shrapnel, and his heart carried the heavy weight of comrades buried in shallow French fields. As he glanced at the curious American children peeking around their mothers' skirts, he felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. He had been told America was heartless, yet these children looked at him not with hatred, but with wonder. For a moment, he thought of his younger sister back home in Munich, hiding in bomb shelters as Allied planes roared overhead. The contrast nearly broke him. Another older prisoner named Otto had fought since Poland, hardened by years of conflict. His eyes were cold, his jaw set in stone. But even he found himself unsettled. As he walked past a bakery, he saw loaves of bread stacked neatly in the window, golden crusts glistening under the morning light. Bread in abundance. Back home, even the strongest struggled to find enough to eat. He clenched his fists, not in anger but in silent disbelief. Was this how America lived even during war? The townsfolk, too, wrestled with conflicting emotions. Some felt fear. Others felt anger, their thoughts flashing to brothers, husbands, and sons still fighting overseas, some never to return. But there was also a quiet curiosity, a dawning realization that these Germans were not faceless monsters, but flesh and blood men tired and weary, no different in stature than their own farmhands or factory workers. That realization unsettled them more than any hatred could. The day wore on, and as the sun dipped lower, the Germans were herded toward a camp on the edge of town, rows of barracks surrounded by fences. Yet the memory of that walk lingered. For the townsfolk, it was the day the war arrived on their doorstep, not with fire or blood, but with strangers in grey uniforms and accents thick with Europe. For the prisoners, it was the day they began to understand that captivity in America would not be the nightmare they feared, but something far more bewildering, a strange, fragile taste of freedom, even while under guard. And as night fell, whispers spread through both the camp and the town. The prisoners lay on their bunks, staring at the wooden rafters, murmuring to each other in the dim light. Can you believe it? They let us walk. They let us see their homes. Meanwhile, in town, families gathered around their dinner tables, telling and retelling the story. They were right here, walking past our stores, and the guards didn't even keep them on chains. The memory of that September day would not fade quickly. It marked the beginning of an uneasy coexistence, a chapter in history that few had expected. German prisoners of war, once feared as ruthless enemies, walking under the American sun, guarded but free, and never able to fully believe what they had seen. The first group of German prisoners stepped onto the red clay roads of Georgia with a mixture of exhaustion and suspicion written across their faces. The journey had been long, across the Atlantic in crowded ships where the smell of salt water and sweat clung to every inch of space, then by train, rumbling through landscapes they could hardly comprehend. Their arrival was not into barbed wire cages, as most had expected, but into the warm autumn light of the American South. It felt almost like a dream. The humidity pressed against their uniforms, and the sun glared from above, harsher than the softer light of their homeland. Tall pine trees stretched toward the sky, their needles whispering in the breeze, and fields of cotton rolled out across the horizon like patches of snow. The men exchanged glances, their whispers in German cautious and tense. "Where are they taking us?" one muttered. "Will they line us up?" another asked. No one had answers. All they had were rumors carried across the ocean, tales of cruel punishments, of starvation, of Americans eager to humiliate the defeated enemy. When the convoy stopped near a farmstead where whitewashed fences bordered the road, the unexpected happened. Instead of being locked away, the prisoners were told they would work. They were to help harvest crops, mend fences, and chop wood. The farmers needed labor. Their sons off fighting overseas, and the Germans, though enemies, had hands strong enough to lift and toil. At first, the POWs were silent, unable to grasp what they were hearing. Work in fields? Among civilians? Could this be a trick? But as the guards explained, gesturing with calm authority rather than shouting, the truth began to sink in. The first day on the fields was awkward, tense, yet strangely liberating. The men bent low in the cotton rows, fingers tugging at the fluffy white bowls that pricked their skin. They sweated under the Georgia sun, their shirts sticking to their backs. But when the farmer's wife appeared carrying a bucket of lemonade and glasses clinking with ice, the moment shattered every expectation. The guards allowed her to pour drinks for the prisoners. The men hesitated, looking at each other as though permission might vanish in an instant. But the guard nodded. One by one they took the glasses. The cold sweetness slid down their throats like nothing they had ever tasted in years of war. Some muttered soft danke under their breath, too surprised to hold back their gratitude. That evening, back at the camp, whispers ran through the bunkhouse like wildfire. They gave us lemonade. Real lemonade, and the woman smiled. Karl, the young soldier captured in Normandy, couldn't stop replaying the moment in his mind. It was the first time since his capture that he felt like more than a number. He told Otto, the older veteran, that he'd seen the farmer's children waving shyly from the porch. Children, waving at us as if we were just men. Otto scoffed, unwilling to admit his own confusion, but deep down he felt the same unease. Nothing in his years of war had prepared him for kindness from the enemy. The days blurred into routine. The prisoners rose early, ate rations that, though simple, were far better than what they had received in the trenches of Europe, and set out under guard to the fields. At first, the locals watched from a distance. They stood by fences, eyes narrowed, their postures stiff with distrust. A few muttered under their breath, "My boys out there fighting, while these fellas are picking cotton like it's nothing." Yet time has a way of softening sharp edges. As weeks passed, the sight of Germans bent over in labor became less threatening, even ordinary. The prisoners themselves were changing. With each passing day, the terror they had carried from Europe loosened its grip. They laughed softly among themselves, trading stories of home. Some tried out halting English words, mimicking the sounds they heard from farmers or guards. "Water, bread, thank you." They fumbled, but their efforts drew surprised smiles from the locals who overheard. Slowly, invisible walls began to crumble. One afternoon, while mending a fence along the edge of a field, Karl dropped his hammer. It rolled across the grass, coming to a stop near a barefoot boy who had been watching from a distance. The boy picked it up and, after a pause, carried it back to him. Their eyes met. Karl hesitated, unsure if he should take it, but the boy pushed it toward him with a small grin. "Here," the boy said. The word was simple, but it pierced Karl like an arrow. He took the hammer gently, nodded, and said, "Danke." The boy laughed, repeating the word back with a thick southern accent, "Danke." From that moment, Karl felt something shift inside him. The guards noticed the changes, too. At first, they had kept a wary eye, fingers near their triggers, ready for escape attempts. But the Germans worked without resistance. They seemed too stunned by their freedom, too bewildered by their treatment, to consider rebellion. Soon the guards carried themselves more casually, their rifles slung low, their conversations easy. They joked sometimes with the prisoners, even if the language barrier made the exchanges clumsy. A laugh shared in broken words carried more weight than anyone expected, and so it went. The prisoners began to earn small wages, a few cents a day, which they could spend at a canteen stocked with basics: soap, candy, stationery. The first time they held American coins in their hands, they marveled at them as though they were relics from another world. Some bought chocolate, savoring the taste with closed eyes, while others purchased paper to write letters home. Those letters, censored but still precious, carried words that startled their families. We are treated fairly. We are given food. We are allowed to work. It is nothing like what we were told. One letter from Otto to his wife read, "I walked through a town today, not as a conqueror, not as a soldier, but as a prisoner who was free to breathe the air of his enemy's streets. I do not know what to make of it. Their children smile at us. Their shops overflow with food. How can I tell you this without sounding mad? It is true. I'm their prisoner, but I feel more human here than I have in years." For the Americans, too, the strangeness deepened. Some farmers confessed quietly to their neighbors that the Germans were good workers, that they got the job done, that they even sang while they worked. A group of prisoners sang folk songs in the fields one afternoon, their voices rising into the warm air. The melodies carried across the rows, unfamiliar but hauntingly beautiful. A farmer's wife stopped her chores just to listen, her heart caught in her throat. For a moment she forgot they were prisoners at all. Still, not everyone welcomed the sight. There were men in town who clenched their fists at the thought of enemy soldiers walking free while American boys bled in France. There were mothers who turned their children away, whispering warnings not to trust the Krauts. The war was too fresh, too bloody for forgiveness to come easily. But the day-to-day encounters chipped slowly at the edges of hatred. The most remarkable thing was how quickly the routine felt normal. Prisoners walking to work under guard, nodding politely at shopkeepers, returning in the evening with dirt on their hands and sweat on their brows. It was a strange coexistence, neither friendship nor enmity, but something that hovered in between. The Germans, who had braced themselves for cruelty, found themselves unmoored instead by dignity. They were watched, yes, but not caged. They were ordered, but not beaten. And in that fragile balance, something extraordinary grew, a flicker of understanding. They began to see America not as the monstrous enemy of propaganda, but as a place where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, even in the midst of war. For Karl, the memory of that first glass of lemonade on a hot Georgia day stayed with him, brighter than any battlefield, stronger than any speech he had ever heard in Germany. For Otto, the smell of fresh bread from a local bakery lingered in his dreams, a symbol of abundance and mercy in a world that had shown him only hunger. For the farmers, the sight of Germans laughing quietly among themselves in the fields reminded them that even enemies carried the same longing for home, the same weariness of war. And so, what began with suspicion slowly transformed into something none of them could have predicted. A group of defeated men found themselves walking under the southern sun, not as beasts of war, not as prisoners in chains, but as workers, neighbors in passing, and, most startling of all, as human beings allowed a glimpse of freedom, guarded though it was. That was the strangeness of America in 1944. And the Germans, no matter how many times they whispered about it in their bunks at night, could never quite believe it was real. By the time the autumn sun slanted lower and the cool winds of October began to drift through the Georgia countryside, the German prisoners had settled into a strange rhythm. What had once seemed unthinkable, walking freely through American fields under only the watch of a few relaxed guards, was now a daily routine. They rose with the dawn, the bugle calling them from their bunks in the camp, and lined up for breakfast. The smell of coffee drifted across the mess hall. The sound of tin trays clattering echoed through the air, and for many of them, it still felt surreal. They were prisoners, yet the food was steady, the treatment humane, the atmosphere almost civilized compared to the brutality they had braced themselves for. As the guards herded them out each morning, the prisoners carried tools instead of rifles, baskets instead of grenades, and a quiet acceptance rather than fear. Some of the men had grown stronger after weeks of farm labor, their skin darkened by the southern sun. They worked side by side in cotton fields, orchards, and even on road repair crews. The pay they received, tiny by American standards but almost unimaginable for captives, allowed them a sliver of freedom. The coins rattling in their pockets were not just metal. They were proof that even in captivity, they retained some fragment of dignity. The first time Karl, the young soldier with blue eyes and scars from Normandy, bought a bar of chocolate from the camp's canteen. He held it in his hands as though it were treasure. He had not tasted chocolate since before the war, before rationing and bombs had torn through his city. He broke the bar into pieces, sharing with the men around him. The sweetness melted on his tongue and pulled him back for just a moment to his childhood home in Munich, where his mother would sometimes save coins to buy him a treat on Sundays. The past rose up so sharply that tears pricked his eyes, and he turned away quickly so the others would not see. Otto, the older veteran who had fought since Poland, chose to spend his coins on paper and envelopes. He wrote long letters to his wife, though many of the words were crossed out by censors before the pages were sent across the ocean. Still, he filled them with careful descriptions. "We work in fields like peasants," he wrote one night under the dim light of a lantern, "but we are not treated as slaves. They pay us. They let us walk through towns. I do not know what to make of this America. It is an enemy that is also merciful. I almost fear that I will not recognize my own country if I ever see it again." Those letters, though filtered by censors, carried truths that stunned their families back home. Wives, mothers, and sisters who had braced for horror read instead about freedom, about kindness, about American shopkeepers nodding politely at their captured men. It was so far from the propaganda that many thought their husbands or sons had gone mad. But for the prisoners themselves, every day added another layer to the disbelief. By November, some prisoners were regularly escorted into small American towns to help with odd jobs, repairing barns, chopping wood, cleaning ditches. At first, the sight of them unsettled the locals. Women carried baskets close to their chests. Old men narrowed their eyes, and shopkeepers stood stiff behind their counters. But the Germans walked quietly, obediently, their steps steady, their heads sometimes bowed, as though they could feel the weight of every gaze. One Saturday afternoon, a group of prisoners was brought into a town near the camp to work on clearing brush from a roadside. As they worked, children gathered at the edge of the square, their curiosity overpowering their fear. A boy no older than 10 pointed and whispered, "Mama, are they Nazis?" His mother shushed him, but could not stop staring herself. The men didn't look like the villains in the newsreels. They looked tired, sunburned, human. One prisoner, wiping sweat from his brow, noticed the children and, without thinking, smiled faintly. The smallest girl tilted her head and then waved, her tiny hand fluttering in the air. To everyone's surprise, the prisoner lifted his hand in return. That tiny gesture rippled across the crowd. Some adults frowned, uneasy with the civility. Others softened, their hearts caught between grief for their own boys overseas and the realization that these men were no different from them. Encounters like that became more frequent. Shopkeepers began to accept the prisoners' coins in exchange for small goods. They bought soap, postcards, or sometimes sweets to tuck into their pockets. One farmer's wife, seeing a group of them pass by, set out a jug of water on her porch. The guards allowed the men to drink, and she nodded at them with a polite, almost maternal kindness. The prisoners whispered about her for days afterward, amazed at the simplicity of it. The bond between the prisoners and the townsfolk was not always smooth. There were men who spat on the ground as they passed, and women who crossed the street to avoid them. Some shouted insults, reminding them that American boys were dying in Europe while these Germans walked free. The anger was raw, understandable, and the prisoners absorbed it silently, their shoulders stiff, their eyes lowered. But alongside the hostility grew something unexpected, curiosity and even respect. Work on the farms forged quiet connections. When a prisoner struggled with a plough, a farmer wordlessly stepped forward, showing him how to guide the mule. When the Germans built fences, they sang folk songs under their breath, songs of mountains and rivers half a world away. The Americans, listening from their porches, could not understand the words, but they recognized the longing in the voices. It sounded like home, like loss, like something bigger than war. Some of the children were bolder than their parents. They approached the prisoners with questions, giggling when the men tried to answer in broken English. The Germans, amused and touched, began teaching them simple German words. "Hello," they'd say, and the children would repeat it with bright laughter. "Danke," they'd add, and the accents were clumsy but cheerful. Within weeks, it was not uncommon to hear a child shout a German greeting across a yard, and a prisoner smile as he answered back. For men who had left their own children behind in bombed-out cities, these moments were like fragments of humanity returned to them. Karl was especially popular among the children. His gentle demeanor and willingness to laugh at their attempts endeared him to them quickly. One afternoon, while helping repair a barn roof, he tossed down small nails to a boy who gathered them with wide-eyed eagerness. "Danke, little helper," Karl said, and the boy beamed as though he had been praised by a hero. For Karl, the moment filled an ache he had carried for months, the ache of missing his sister, of wanting to protect rather than destroy. Otto, hardened as he was, found himself unsettled by the contradictions of captivity. He worked silently, his back bent with years of soldiering. But one evening, after a long day in the fields, he confessed quietly to Karl, "It is strange. Here I feel less like a prisoner than I did as a soldier. There is no shouting, no bombs, no commanders. Only work, and the Americans, they do not hate us as much as they should. That frightens me more than their hatred ever could." Karl nodded, for he too felt that same unease. The kindness made them question everything they had been told. As winter approached, the rhythm of work shifted. Instead of harvesting, the prisoners were tasked with chopping wood, clearing land, and repairing roads battered by autumn rains. The guards wore thicker coats, their rifles slung lazily across their shoulders, and sometimes they offered cigarettes to the prisoners when the day ended. Around smoky fires, Germans and Americans occasionally shared words, gestures, even laughter. The war was never far from anyone's thoughts, but in those quiet evenings, it felt as though the world had paused. The Germans wrote about these moments in their letters, though often carefully. "We chop wood for farmers," one prisoner wrote. "They treat us fairly. We even smile sometimes. Do not worry, I am safe." Another confessed, "It is strange, but I feel freer here as a prisoner than I ever did in uniform. Do not believe everything you hear about Americans. They are not devils." For the townsfolk, the shock had worn off. By the turn of the year, they spoke of the prisoners as part of the scenery, as ordinary as the cotton fields and the red dirt roads. The Germans became less a name for enemies and more for workers who repaired bridges, fixed fences, and carried buckets of water. Some still kept their distance, their hearts raw with grief for loved ones overseas, but even they admitted the men were not what they had imagined. The most remarkable change was within the prisoners themselves. They no longer walked with the rigid stiffness of men expecting blows. They moved with cautious ease, their eyes taking in the world around them with quiet wonder. They had come to America as captives, but found themselves caught in something far stranger, a life that was part prison, part freedom, and entirely unlike anything they had believed possible, and in the soft space between labor and leisure, between suspicion and acceptance, they began to see America not through the lens of propaganda or battle, but through its smallest, most ordinary moments. A farmer teaching them to tie a knot, a child waving from a porch, a woman setting out a jug of water on a hot day. These were the fragments that stayed with them, the moments they carried back to their bunks each night, whispering to each other in disbelief. They were still prisoners. They knew it every time the gates of the camp closed behind them, every time the guards counted them in rows. But they were also witnesses to something far more powerful than chains, the quiet, bewildering mercy of an enemy who allowed them to walk in the open air, to earn their bread, to laugh under the same sun. And as the weeks turned into months, they began to realize that these experiences were changing them in ways the war never had. By the spring of 1945, the rhythm of life in the Georgia camp had settled into something so familiar that the prisoners sometimes forgot they were prisoners at all. They woke at dawn, lined up for breakfast, marched under watchful but casual guards to the fields, the orchards, the roads. They carried tools instead of rifles, swung axes instead of bayonets, and worked with the steady patience of men who knew this labor was not punishment, but survival. And yet, beneath the routine, there was a current of unease that none of them could ignore. They knew the war was still raging overseas, and every scrap of news brought into the camp, whether shouted from radios in the guardhouse or whispered from letters smuggled in, reminded them that their world was changing. The guards did not keep the news secret. They talked openly, sometimes within earshot of the prisoners, about battles, about Allied victories, about Germany's retreat. The Germans listened, some with stony faces, some with slumped shoulders, others with thin hope that the war might end soon. Karl, the young soldier whose quiet kindness had endeared him to children in town, often strained to catch every word. "Berlin is surrounded," one guard said one afternoon, as the men rested after chopping wood. Karl translated for the others, and a heavy silence settled over the group. Otto, the older veteran who had fought since the first days of the war, muttered, "Then it is over. The Reich is finished." For many the words brought relief. The war had consumed their youth, their families, their futures. To hear that it was ending was to glimpse a life beyond endless marching and fighting. But the thought of returning home filled them with dread as well. They had grown used to America's strange mercy, to the freedom of walking streets under guard, to the food that filled their stomachs and the coins that jingled in their pockets. What would await them in Germany? Ruins, hunger, faces they no longer recognized? As the weeks passed, preparations for repatriation began quietly in the camp. Prisoners were told they would soon be sent back to Europe. Some cheered, eager to see their homes again. Others sat on their bunks, staring at the wooden rafters, lost in thought. Karl confessed to Otto one evening, "I don't know if I want to leave. Here I feel like I can breathe. What will I find in Munich? Ashes?" Otto gave no answer. He simply stared at the floor, his mind filled with the same question. Life in the towns had grown strangely normal with the Germans present. Farmers spoke of them as dependable workers. Shopkeepers told stories of their halting English, their polite bows when making purchases. Children boasted to each other about learning German words from the prisoners. Even those who had once spat on the ground in disgust began to admit, quietly, reluctantly, that the men were not monsters. They were simply soldiers, caught in a war they did not control, but the approach of their departure stirred complicated feelings. Some townsfolk were glad. "Good riddance," one man said at the general store. "Send them back to clean up their own mess." Others felt a tug of sorrow they could not explain. A farmer's wife admitted to her neighbor, "They worked our fields like they belonged here. When they go, it will feel empty." The children, most of all, struggled to understand. They asked their parents why the men who had taught them funny words and fixed their fences had to leave. No parent had an easy answer. The last days were filled with small moments that burned into memory. On one warm afternoon, Karl was sent with a work detail into town to repair a bridge. As he hammered planks into place, a little girl approached and handed him a flower, a wild daisy plucked from the roadside. He froze, staring at the tiny gift. The guards tensed, but the girl only smiled shyly. Karl accepted it with trembling fingers, nodding his thanks. That night, he pressed the flower between the pages of a notebook, determined to carry it back across the ocean. Otto, too, found himself touched in ways he did not expect. While splitting logs behind a farmhouse, the farmer's wife came out with a plate of cornbread. She offered it without a word, her eyes serious but not unkind. Otto accepted, chewing slowly, the warm bread soft on his tongue. For a man who had known only hunger during the war, it was almost unbearable. He wanted to ask her why she would give kindness to an enemy, but the words would not come. The guards grew more relaxed in those final days. Some even struck up conversations with the prisoners, exchanging jokes in broken language. One night around a fire, an American sergeant passed a cigarette to Otto. The old soldier hesitated, then took it, inhaling deeply. They smoked in silence, two men from opposite sides of the war, sharing a peace that no treaty had yet signed. When the order finally came, it arrived without ceremony. The prisoners were told to pack what little they had. They would be transported to the coast, then shipped back to Europe. The barracks buzzed with nervous energy as men folded shirts, tucked away coins, slipped letters into their pockets. Some carried small tokens given to them by locals, a handkerchief, a carved piece of wood, a photograph. Karl clutched the notebook with the pressed flower, unwilling to let it out of his sight. The morning of departure was heavy with silence. The prisoners lined up, their boots thudding softly on the dirt. The guards moved them toward buses, the same kind that had once brought them into town under the suspicious eyes of Americans. But this time, the townsfolk did not watch with fear. They gathered quietly along the road, some with arms crossed, others with hands folded. A few even raised their hands in farewell. As the buses rolled forward, Karl pressed his face to the glass, watching the town slide past. He saw the bakery where the smell of bread had once stunned him, the shop where he had bought chocolate, the porch where children had waved. He saw ordinary houses, gardens, clotheslines fluttering in the breeze. Ordinary life. It struck him with such force that his chest ached. For months he had walked those streets under guard, a prisoner who was somehow freer than he had ever been in uniform. Otto sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, but his thoughts were louder than any words. He remembered the cornbread, the cigarettes, the quiet nods of farmers who had once glared at him with hate. He remembered working in the sun, sweat dripping down his back, feeling alive in a way he hadn't since before the war. And he wondered if, when he returned to a broken Germany, he would ever again know such moments. The buses carried them away, the guards silent, the prisoners lost in thought. Behind them, the town slowly returned to its routines. The fields would be worked by others now, the shops would hum as always, the children would grow up. But something lingered in the air, a memory that would not fade easily. For the prisoners, the journey back to Europe was filled with uncertainty. Some would return to rubble, to families scattered, to hunger that bit deeper than any prison camp. But they carried with them something unexpected, stories of a place where enemies had allowed them to walk freely, to earn wages, to taste lemonade and cornbread, to be treated as men instead of beasts. Stories of small towns in America where kindness had slipped past barbed wire. Years later, when the war was only a shadow in their past, many of those men would tell their children and grandchildren about it. They would describe the fields of Georgia, the sound of American folk songs on radios, the laughter of children learning German words. They would speak of guards who carried rifles but did not raise them, of farmers who shared bread, of towns where they felt both captive and free. And for some, those memories would weigh heavier than the battles they had fought. For in the end, what lingered was not the roar of artillery, but the quiet astonishment of being shown mercy by those they had once sworn to destroy. It was a lesson none of them could have predicted, that in the strangest corners of war, humanity could bloom stronger than barbed wire, and that sometimes the fiercest enemy could become the keeper of your dignity. And so, as the buses rolled toward the coast, carrying the men back to a continent in ruins, they looked out at the American countryside and knew they would never forget it. They had come as prisoners of war, They were leaving as witnesses to something far greater, the fragile, bewildering freedom of walking through enemy towns and discovering, to their disbelief, that they had been treated as men all along. The war would end. Nations would rebuild. Lies would scatter. But the memory of those days, the days when German soldiers roamed American streets under guard yet unchained, would remain, lodged in their hearts like a truth too strange to ever fade. And for many, that taste of freedom would haunt them far longer than the war itself.